And so the focus of today really sprang from conversations we had a few days ago,
Hmm.
where we talked about military table organizations and equipment, or like we used to call it back in the day, the MTO. And the MTO is set up a certain way to where it told each unit what they got, how many of the thing they got, and why they got it. Right now, that was it at a company level. At the company level, it'll it'll say stuff like, "Oh, you're authorized 6 Humvees, right,
Yep.
and 2 Deuce and a Half trucks, and a helicopter, whatever." And
Mhm.
there's you have to justify it. There's reasons and there's logistics behind it. Now, for our purposes, we're going to look at the 30,000 foot view of the solar system at 2354. There's one major governing body called the ICA. What's the ICA?
Well, the ICA is an acronym, as most things are in these types of settings, and what it means is the Interplanetary Cooperative Administration.
It started out as the United Nations in space,
Hmm.
but then again, it didn't work. Like there was a Tyndall Treaty made it like the Articles of Confederation,
Yeah,
but then the Brookenden Accords turned it into kind of more of a federalized, centralized government.
the Tyndall Accords are like the Declaration of Independence. The Brookenden Accords are like the Constitution. And then it wasn't immediately like flipping on a light switch where like because the Tyndall Accords were signed in 2051. The Brookenden Accords took effect 10 years later. So there's about a 10-year gap there where the ICA was just kind of getting on its feet.
Kind of
But
like how the United States and Articles of Confederation was sniping at each other. The states were levying taxes against each other. It was a giant mess.
yes, exactly. Kind of like, how basically for I think they started ratifying the Constitution, I want to say in like 1789, and that's like 13 years after the United States technically existed.
Mm-hmm.
So for anywhere between 6 to 13 years, the United States was kind of just getting started. It was kind of like a fetus country,
Exactly.
for lack of a better word. Um,
Exactly. And
and
so
then when the Constitution came along, it set things more in stone. That's pretty much what happened with the ICA.
in 2354, you've got this giant parent organization called the ICA.
Mm-hmm.
And so it starts off as kind of a loose confederation, but then becomes more of a federalized government that ensures commerce, ensures domestic tranquility for the solar system, provides for the common defense, all the familiar things.
Yeah,
Um,
basically. I mean, there's an earlier version. This is a fun Easter egg for those of our listeners who may be long time listeners or may be interested in following this story. Hopefully,
sure.
for years. There's an earlier version of the ICA that I think predates even us working on the Erebus effect together, like through the course of 2023, in which it was not called the Cooperative Administration; it was called the Colonial Administration. And I
Yeah.
shared that name on I think Reddit somewhere, like on a post about some with like I think it was a post of the ICA flag, and someone's like, "Well, it doesn't make sense for the UN to use colonial in its like for the UN to use colonial in a name of one of its organizations." I was like, "Yeah, that really makes sense." And I think the analogy still holds, but I think the origins are kind of there because that's basically what it is. It started off as Earth kind of sticking up an umbrella over all of its little colonies on Mars and in the asteroid belt and on the outer moons of the outer giant planets and so on. But eventually, that umbrella kind of became a birdcage. I think that's a good way to put
Exactly.
it.
And
And
so you've got the ICA that oversees the solar system. Beneath them is the IDC. What's the IDC?
the IDC is the Interplanetary Defense Corps, and that is basically another word salad that basically means Department of Defense. They were activated in 2054, so funnily enough, 300 years before the Airbus effect, by what's called the Nakhimov-Harrington Act, which is an act of the original ICA Council before, predating even the Brooklyn Accords. And basically what this act said is, hey, we're going to take the space forces of participating countries that buy in, and we're going to combine at least parts of them to make a new unified force that will act as a security and peacekeeping force for all of us. Because that way, it's not like the United States just securing the United States territory and China securing Chinese territory. It's everybody, throwing a buck into the hat so we can all buy security for everybody.
Yeah.
So again, it started, but again, as I think I can see the gears working in your head. This is another thing that we talked about in our talk a couple of days ago. It started off that way as sort of a basically UN peacekeeping force, but for space, and eventually metastasized and sort of mutated and evolved into the Department of Defense.
As all the best organizations do.
Well, as it's mission creep. As humanity spread through the solar system, there became need for more and more spacers, more and more spending, more and more weapons development and research. And an organization that started off with maybe 1 million spacers, by the time of the Airbus effect, has like 3.5 million. It started off with maybe 6 or 7 AEFs, which is an Aerospace Expeditionary Force, which is sort of like
brigade combat team.
It's kind of like a brigade combat team. It's kind of analogous to a cross between the brigade combat team and a Marine expeditionary unit.
Sure.
It's the basic unit that gets sent out that has all of the components it needs to be on expedition, so to speak, on a planet in a solar in a sector of space, whatever. It's about 140,000 spacers on average per AEF at the time of the Airbus effect, and at the time of the Airbus effect, it's like 24 of them, plus some extemporaneous spacers on the side. It's about 3.5 million spacers in total.
Hello, stranger. Do you like to read?
Read? What's happening? Am I dead?
I bet you like zombie books.
I like food. Do you have food?
You don't need food at dividedbyzerobooks.com. It's full of nutrient-rich science fiction.
Ugh, I'm stuck in an ad, aren't I?
Once I stop talking, reality will collapse until someone plays this ad again. This isn't the first time we've had this discussion, and it won't be the last. Hello, stranger. Do you like to read?
The ICA is like the Congress and the Senate. They levy taxes, they raise armies. If you don't pay your taxes, sending in the Spacer Corps isn't their first option, but basically taxes are collected at gunpoint, right? I know my libertarianism is showing, but still. So they're a federalized government, is what they are.
Yes, they're more or less a federalized government. They're sort of, it's ironic that the Alliance is their opponent in this, because they're kind of like the Alliance in Firefly. That's a good analogy.
Yeah.
Basically a centralized government that says, come to us, we have all the good stuff, and if you don't, you'll be sorry.
Yes. And so, and don't get me wrong, I pay my taxes. I'm a believer in taxes. That's fine. Now, to take all of this back, the origins of both of these are the Lunar War.
Yep. Lunar War is a concept that I came up with, funnily enough, independently of some other people who've come up with it, who've made some really great content, but that's a whole other topic. But I came up with it independently like 3 or 4 years ago. I came up with this idea of having this war on the moon that would predate the formation of the ICA. And basically the war on the moon is fought between the militaries of Western NATO-aligned countries and China-aligned Shanghai Pact countries, basically. And these two opposing forces set up bases on the moon between the 2020s, between the late 2010s and the 2040s. And by the mid-2040s, they were sort of locked in a standoff. And then in 2049, late 2049, this standoff boiled over. and they fought not really a long war, but kind of an intense war, because there's ships whistling around in orbit, sending missiles and kinetic kill vehicles at each other, shooting lasers at each other from hundreds of kilometers away. And there was a ground component. Most of the Lunar War was fought in orbit, but there was a ground component, because there's at least one character in one of the expanded universe stories of the Spacers Saga who was a veteran of the ground component of the Lunar War, who was basically guarding an outpost for most of the time, and then went on an expedition. I think I sent you his story at some point. I think it was a quote where he says, my Lunar War lasted 3 days, and on the third day I killed 7 people, and then was shot 5 times or something like that. Something like that.
Yeah.
I got a medal for that 3rd day, and I put those medals in a drawer, and I never looked at them again, or something like that. That's basically the inciting incident in the creation of the ICA, because a little, or rather, over the 2 years that followed the Lunar War, there was debate in the UN about how to prevent future conflicts like this that could disrupt commerce, that could possibly threaten life on Earth, that could possibly escalate to the point of World War III, which is, of course, the whole point of the UN as it was intended, 100 years before that. When it was founded. Actually, I think it was 78 years ago yesterday was when the UN Charter took effect, October 24th, 1945. Funnily enough. But it was founded basically with one goal, which is we don't want to fight another world war.
No.
Obviously, there's plenty of other goals that have been attached on and sought after with varying degrees of success. But so far, we haven't had another world war, so fingers crossed.
Fingers crossed.
There's an organization called, I think, like UNUSA. It's like UN Organization for the Office. It's like UN Office for the Outer Space Affairs or something like that. And that's actually exactly what it is. And they basically are sort of predecessor to the ICA. But the ICA was more set in stone in terms of being basically a UN for off-world affairs. Basically, once you pass the von Karman line, the Karman line, I think it is, which is the usually the established boundary between the Earth's atmosphere and space, you're in the domain of the ICA. And the ICA deals with commerce, deals with trade, deals with interplanetary governance. And as we talked about before the ad break, it gradually grew as, the ICA and the IDC both grew over time because their scope just grew. Because, as new planets were settled, as new worlds were settled, as new stations were set up, as new people moved outside the atmosphere of the Earth, they had to grow. It's sort of like how, but, it's like, people could probably argue that, the United States experienced a certain amount of scope creep, because when it started off, there was 5 million people in the country. Yeah. And you didn't have to provide as much, and there was only some of them could vote, only some of them had rights. Nowadays,
slaves.
Yeah, some of them are slaves. Nowadays, at least in theory, everyone has rights, everyone can vote, and everyone is equal. And you have to provide for all those people. Nowadays there's a lot more people. There's like 330 something million people. Because the thing about the ICA is that it would be created at a point where, if the ICA were to come to fruition in 2051, there would be somewhere north of probably 8.5 billion people on the Earth.
Well, the ICA started off as kind of more of a ramshackle Articles of Confederation thing. The Lunar War was brought to a head because within the Spacers Saga, there's this funky little climate change that goes on and kind of keeps going. And, due to the, over industrialization and not a lot of limits put in place. And from what I understand, and correct me if I'm wrong, and remember, you're George Lucas, so you can tell me if I'm wrong. The Lunar War is fought over mining rights for fuel, right? Because
for helium, basically, for helium and other things used for fusion. Well, I'll explain it this way: the power that the nuclear power that we have had providing power from power plants for the last 70, 80 years, however long it's been exactly, is fission, where you're taking one heavy element and throwing in another heavy element and making them break apart, and the energy that comes out is what you capture and use to drive a reaction that then powers, cities and stuff.
Okay.
Fusion is the opposite. You take smaller elements like hydrogen, helium, so on, and you smash them together hard enough to make them fuse into heavier elements. That's literally what happens in the sun. That's what powers the stars. It's thermonuclear reactions.
Like
the problem is that fusion is harder to do for humans. It's the only way we know of, at least as of now, assuming that there hasn't been some major fusion development in the time between when we recorded this and when we published it. Fusion is still hard to do because you have to have an energy to make those light elements fuse, and they don't even do it easily in the sun. It's like 1 out of every billion reactions or something. There's so many reactions happening that they happen to add up. I can't remember what the exact number is. I learned this in astronomy class, 10 years ago or something, almost. But the thing about fusion is that it's basically clean energy. If you had enough fuel, you could provide clean energy that would let you clean up the Earth in theory, because you could at least in theory help cure our dependence on fossil fuels and help us then start to divest from those those systems that are pumping CO2 and other greenhouse gases into the atmosphere.
Yeah.
And basically what happens in the Spacers Saga is we crack fusion and start slowly saving the Earth. The basic problem is that it's too late, because the problem with climate science, as any climate scientist would probably tell you, is that once you start down that, it's almost like Star Wars. Once you start down the dark path, forever will it dominate your destiny. Once you start heading towards a new plateau in climate trends, you're basically going to be on that roller coaster until you get to the new plateau, and then it's going to stabilize out unless you totally fuck it up again. And basically, I'm going on the assumption that by the mid to late 21st century, we will be heading towards that next plateau. And
what is this plateau you mean?
Well, by plateau, I mean like, the next point of stability, where it's like a certain degrees above the baseline global average temperature, certain amount of sea level rise, certain amount of ice cap melt, certain amount of the calamity caused to all the Earth's climate processes. So that there's worse storms, worse droughts, worse all these things. And
so we establish a level of consistency.
Yes.
It's a miserable level of consistency.
Yes, and the thing is, it doesn't happen right away. That's the problem. The level of consistency we could probably learn to adjust with, which is a scary thing, because there's talk that in 2024 that we could see unlivable heat and food shortages within a couple decades. But by the end of the century or by the next century, that could be who knows what, because we don't know when the next plateau is going to come. We can sort of predict for it, sort of model it, but we don't exactly know. And when it comes right down to it, all we can do is sort of cross our fingers and just prepare for the worst and try and make things as best as we can if that is the case. But basically, the reason this pertains to the Spacers Saga is that some of this climate catastrophe involves things like, really screwing up the rice harvest in China and India. And because of that intensifies things that are already going on, like a helium speculation. That's actually something that's baked into the lore already, is that by the early to mid 2040s, around the time that the lunar Cold War is starting to heat up, there's rampant speculation on lunar helium, because of course, this big emergent, really profitable market, there's going to be speculators who step in and want to make extra money for themselves, and in so doing, they make things worse for everybody else. And because of that, there's a crash, which then leads to the lunar Cold War spiking in intensity, which then leads to the lunar war. And I think what your next point is.
Exactly. And I don't want to go too deep in the specifics of the Lunar War themselves and how that story plays out,
Mm-hmm.
because I feel like there's a novella in there somewhere
Yeah,
that,
someday.
yeah, we talked offline about the specifics on like
Mm-hmm.
what caused the peace and what caused the war and all that, and we'll go deeper into that later on. But let's talk about the release of Spacers: The Erebus Effect.
Let's do that.
What are your, as of now, as of recording, we just got our paperback copies in.
Yes, we
How'd
did.
that feel getting that?
Oh man, it felt really good. It's like winning. It's like I don't know if winning a marathon is the right analogy, but it's like beating a marathon. It's like racing them. It's like running a marathon and coming across the finish line. You feel yourself coming towards that final, release for so long, and then you come to the finish line. You're like, oh, thank God! You put your hands in the air, and you can stop running, and you can just sort of coast on that energy until the next marathon needs to be run, which is whatever our next book is. But for now, you can just sort of live off that high of adrenaline,
Yeah.
excitement of having beat the odds.
Yeah, having completed a project, having, because the finishing, creating anything, like getting any book to market is borderline impossible, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that's if everything is working perfectly. It's borderline impossible, right? But just because it's a hard thing to do, you know. I think back to the first version of Erebus you showed me called Shadow Play years ago, back in 2020. Back when we were the first time we were working together, kind of our first dry run, the beta test, as it were. And it was going to be our next book. And then we took a year or two off, and then we kind of linked back up. And I remember I'm at the theater with you, and we're seeing a play. And I don't remember what it is. It's probably something silly and fun and musical like they all were. And I said, hey, man, let me take a look at that Shadow Play draft we did a while back. And it kind of became this. And so makes me
Yeah.
really happy. If you're gonna pitch Spacers: The Erebus Effect to somebody, what would you tell them it's about?
I would tell them that, I've always kind of been partial to your little sort of haphazard elevator pitch, is that it's kind of a gender bent Blade Runner set on Mars with a little more paranoia and a dash of um, conspiracy thriller thrown in. Because there's some conspiracy thriller sort of in the second Blade Runner movie, but there's not as much in the first one. The first one's more just of a straight kind of detective thriller. This one involves some conspiracy. This one involves some like existential danger.
Yeah.
But what it basically boils down to is a woman is a female detective chasing down rogue humanoid synthetic artificial beings and finding out that there's something going on within human society as it relates to these artificial beings that is dangerous, and she has a role in it.
There's like an artificial revolution, as it
Yeah.
were, artificial intelligence revolution, and she's got to stop it before it starts.
So
And
there's a line from something I can't remember what it is, but it's like you may recognize this. So if you do, please catch me on it. But it basically says, the we'll take over your society. We'll live within your ranks. We'll grow from within your numbers. And the best part is you'll never even know it.
yeah, yeah. And then one day you wake up, it's like an invasion of the body snatchers almost.
Yeah, basically.
And
Because as we're kind of bringing things full circle to what we talked about last year on the podcast, this is something that I drew from actually more from reading the book that became Blade Runner. That is, Android's Dream of Electric Sheep. There's a scene in the Android's Dream of Electric Sheep where Rick Deckard's character gets captured by what is insinuated to be a replicant, police officer, and taken to an all replicant police station where they're like sort of setting up like a secret society within the regular human society of San Francisco. It's not Los Angeles in the book; it's San Francisco, because it's supposed to be like an old detective novel. But it's kind of like he gets here. He's like, what the hell is going on? There's all these like, of course they call them androids in the book, but there's all these androids running around acting like people. And that's kind of classic Philip K. Dick. It's chipping your circuits of thinking this can't be real, but can it? That's kind of where I came up with. I mean, there's a very specific part of the Airbus effect that I won't give away here since it's just coming out. That is almost entirely modeled on that, where there's like this sort of this sense of compromise, and not compromising like we're going to come to an agreement, compromising like, oh, we're compromised, we're we need to get out of here.
Yeah. And
that came great. I lifted that almost whole cloth from the Android's Dream of Electric Sheep.
I can see where you lifted the vibe and you're inspired by it. I wouldn't say you lifted it whole cloth, sir. I'd say you took kind of homage from Dick's idea, and kind of with our partnership, we kind of made it our own very much.
Mm-hmm.
And there's this notion that runs through the book, this question that our main character, the protagonist, Janet Harkov, is asking is, am I a good person?
What does it mean to be human?
Yeah.
And in this case, the answer to both, ironically enough, what does it mean to be human and am I a good person, is, does it matter? Yeah.
And I think we can wind it down here, because Spacers, the Airbus Effect is available on Amazon.com, the paperback, for $9.99. Or you can go to the Spacers Saga blog at dividedbyzerobooks.com. For 5 big ones, you can have unlimited access to the ebook version, which is being released 2 chapters a month through the whole run of the book.
Yep.
And as for an audio experience, as a visual audio experience, stay tuned to the end of this episode, because we recorded the first 12 minutes of an audiobook for Spacers, the Airbus Effect, starring yours truly.
And I think this is going to be a good year for us.
I think it's going to be a great year for us. For the Blanket Fortress of Solitude, I am Derwin.
And I am Nick.
Chapter 1. New Galley, Mars, 2354. The night was cold and dark. Desert dust mingled with the air, forcing its way into your clothes and clinging to your hair, coating your skin, drowning your soul. The soul of Mars ran red with the blood of innocence, and on a night like tonight, there were always folks willing to spill a little more. Special Agent Janet Harkov strode out of the night, scanning the street. She had close-cropped hair the color of sand and wore a stark frown that betrayed her impatience for bullshit. After taking in the scenery, her dark, taciturn eyes settled on a building to her right on the south side of the street. It bore a faded neon sign proclaiming antiques hanging over the door, which was turned off. Janet reached out and rang the doorbell. A muffled buzzing came from the inside. Following a long pause, the door creaked open. A weathered face appeared in the sliver of darkness, twisted into a scowl. "Can't you see we're closed?" the man said, nodding toward the dimmed open sign. As he swung the door shut, Janet caught it with her right hand and said, "I'm going to have to insist." The man's scowl returned. "Look, if you're going to cause a scene, then I'm going to have to call the..." Janet deftly withdrew her ID wallet with her free hand and flipped it open. It displayed a silver shield and the stylized letters ALCA, along with her agent's credentials. The name Harkov, Janet E. stood out in a well-defined black letters next to the stern-faced ID photo. "Don't bother," she said, in a voice like polished granite. "Someone went to the trouble already." That's why I'm here. This is an official ALCA investigation. Ignoring the man's sputtering, she forced the door open and pushed in past him, returning her credentials deftly to her pocket as she did. She looked around, taking in the interior of the store. The tables were weighed down with cellular phones, dusty circuit board computers, and video disc players, most centuries old. She grinned as she took in the scenery, telling him this sure is a nice setup you've got here. She picked up a wind-up toy monkey off a display table, having only seen one before in vintage movies. She was half tempted to wind up the little piece of history and just see it clang away. But instead she continued, telling the old man, the anonymous tip we received told us you might be trafficking livelier trinkets than this. She placed the monkey down and turned to face him, neatly crossing her arms, her eyes boring into his, telling him the artificial kind, that is. The old man licked his lips. Unable to keep her gaze for long, he smiled, showing several crooked teeth. The expression was clearly forced. He couldn't even bring himself to deny it. Janet smiled faintly, understanding. She turned on her heel, scanning the room in a businesslike manner. She spotted a door along the back wall of the main room with a faded employees only sign tacked onto it. She stepped toward the door. I'll just look around for myself then. I'm sure you won't mind. As she neared the door, the old man rushed to intercept her. He had found his confidence again. No. I'm afraid that is out of the question. I'm sorry you came all this way here for nothing. He put a commanding hand on her shoulder, telling her, I'll show you the door. Janet turned her head and disdainfully looked at his hand. The look on her face would have told a wiser man what kind of danger he was in. Then her placid smile returned. I think I'll stay here, thanks. She opened the back room door and stepped through. She paid no mind to the old man's protest, finding herself awash in a dizzying array of old tech knickknacks, layer upon layer in baskets that were stacked on shelves, almost scraping the 3-meter ceiling. She strode down the center aisle and rounded a corner, her right hand instinctively reaching for the left side of her jacket. The old man kept pace behind her. He was shouting now. Now listen here. This is my establishment, and I have a right to privacy. You have yet to produce a warrant, and I will not allow. Janet wheeled on him, one finger raised, dangerously. As a matter of fact, you have no such rights. Article 18, subsections 4 through 9 of the Harrison Accord state that I can search the premises for contraband of the artificial sort without any need of a warrant or prior alert of said search. That means if you get in my way, your right to privacy isn't the only right you'll be forfeiting tonight. As she spoke, someone came around the corner. A tall, athletic man who looked to be about 20, wearing pristine blue coveralls and carrying a bundle of spare parts. He had dark hair and tanned olive skin. The stranger said nothing, staring at Janet with widened eyes that broadcast an intense, uneasy tension. The old man stepped up next to Janet and continued his protest. Yes, he is my assistant, he sputtered, putting himself between Janet and the other man. He's been here almost a year now. Janet shot a glance at the old man and then turned to the stranger again and put her hand on her hip. So what's the story? She pointed to the coveralls with her other hand. Those are pretty clean for someone who's been working in an antique electronics shop for a year. He said nothing, still glaring at her. She stared straight back, slowly moving her hand towards the holster. Show me your wrist, pal. And then, quicker than Janet could whip out her pistol, he exploded to life. He threw the bundle of spare parts at Janet and then charged her, almost bowling her over as he made for the rear exit. Stop! The old man shouted as the runner reached the door. They'll kill you if you run! Janet shoved him aside, pistol drawn. She practically leapt out of the rear door and down the stoop after him, only to find the suspect had vanished. Shit! She yelled. Then she pressed a button on her wrist-mounted data device. Zero, are you there? I'm at the back exit of the old antique shop. Get the local Marsec precinct on the line. There's an old man inside who is sheltering the suspect. Have the local operatives book him when they arrive. I'm going after the goddamn Zarky. Do you have a visual on where it's headed? Not waiting for a response, Janet took off down the rear of the storefront, then rounded the corner into an alley leading back to the main street. She scanned for movement, then took off again. When she reached the street, it was more crowded than before. Late night revelers were gathering, wandering about the streets in search of one more drink before last call. Soon the Union Day celebrations would be starting. Zero's voice returned a moment later. Harkov, I got it. It's headed south, down the street, just ahead of you. Janet swiveled, craning her neck for the sign of her target. Its dark coveralls were like a spotlight against the bright outfits of the civvies. Janet pursued, the skyline looming ahead of her like dark glittering mountains. Reaching the crowd of revelers, she waved her badge over her head. Get out of the way, she shouted. ALCA, let me through. The dumbfounded people parted like pages of a book, allowing her enough space to continue forward. A sloppy drunk in a tattered Dayglow smoking jacket grabbed her ass as she pressed past him and got a broken hand in return. She pressed through more crowds of people, her eyes still straining to catch a glimpse of the running man in blue coveralls. There. She saw her target ducking through a crowd further down the street. Shoving through a cluster of civilians, Janet tore off again after her quarry. This was where she was in her element, hunting hostiles, just like the old days. Just like Titan, she thought, grinning. A crackly voice sounded in the bud in her left ear. Harkov, I've got your location. Bad guys on the next street over. She pressed 2 fingers of her left hand to the side of her neck, activating the subdermal microphone located there. I'm going to try to force the thing into a corner. See if you can find me a dead end somewhere. After a breath, she went on. It's already bolted once. I'm legal to retire on sight. With that, she burst ahead at full tilt, almost knocking down an old man with a much younger woman on his arm, both of whom barely just got out of her way as she barreled past. The street ahead reached a 4-way junction with an antique wrought iron fountain near the center. A going-away party outside the fountain had merged with 3 bachelor parties. All 4 groups had conglomerated into a raucous tornado of self-destruction. Janet didn't concern herself with any of this. All she cared about was the cover the crowd provided for an artificial on the run, already all but indistinguishable from the humans around it. It was further ahead now, and rapidly gaining distance. Now it was time for desperate measures. She pointed her weapon up at the sky. Everyone get down, she shouted, and then she squeezed the trigger. Dozens of people reflexively ducked or threw themselves to the ground at the sound of the shot. As it echoed off the buildings throughout the square, she clearly saw her target. It was the only one in sight who failed to duck at the sound of the gunshot. It was now turning down one of the side streets, heading directly for a blind alley. Janet leapt down the pedestal and took off again. She activated the subdermal mic. Zero, get the local precinct down here. Tell them to be ready for crowd control. And tell the agency to bring a tag and bag team for when I'm done with this piece of shit. In her ear, Zero's voice crackled. I thought you were going to take this one alive. Janet ignored him. She had made up her mind. The ones that caused trouble could spread funny ideas. For Janet's money, it was better to cut off the head of the snake before it got too big to wrangle. Up ahead, Janet could see the Zarn reach the dead end. It didn't miss a beat. Turning on its heel and aiming to take off past her before she made up her mind to shoot. That's why you never give them a chance, Janet thought bitterly. She'd seen it gone wrong so many times. She wasn't about to make that mistake again. Luckily, the wayward Zarn had taken a wrong turn down a dead end. Janet caught up to her target and came to a quick halt a half-dozen paces away. She raised her pistol and aimed it at the artificial, now swiveling its head in search of an escape. End of the line, she said firmly. Put your hands on your head and get on your knees now. She tightened her grip on the weapon. It had run, which meant she was within her rights to kill it. All she needed, all she wanted, was a reason. All she had to do was wait.